astonishing. Look closely right there.
I see it. What does this mean?
Imagine carrying a secret inside your body for 62 years and only discovering it in the operating room. Thomas Whitaker went in for what he thought was a harmless lump on his back, and what doctors found shocked the world: a fully developed parasitic twin. Could you live your entire life with someone silently guiding you without ever knowing it? If this story makes you wonder about the hidden mysteries in your own life, comment below with what you think you might have ignored in your body or instincts. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the full, unbelievable story of Thomas and his secret twin. Evelyn Whitaker had always considered herself a practical woman. She didn't put much stock in dreams, omens, or the kind of folk superstitions her grandmother used to whisper about in the kitchen of their small Georgia farmhouse. But nothing about this pregnancy felt right, and no matter how hard she tried to explain it away, something inside her kept saying, "Something is off." It was her first child. She was 28, married to James, a steady man who worked at the local rail yard. They had just moved into a modest 3-bedroom home on the edge of town, not far from where the pines opened into soybean fields. Everything should have felt full of promise. Instead, Evelyn often woke up in cold sweats, her hands pressed over her belly, trembling. The dreams came almost every night: 2 babies in a dark room, one reaching for her, crying, the other fading, almost transparent, watching in silence. At her 4-month checkup, she tried to explain it to Dr. Cohen, a gray-haired man in his early 60s who delivered half the town's children. "I know this sounds silly, but I feel like there's more than one in there," she said, her voice tight. He chuckled, not unkindly. "First baby nerves, Mrs. Whitaker. 1 heartbeat, 1 baby. That's what the stethoscope says, and it hasn't failed me yet. But I've been feeling like flutters on both sides, and I'm growing faster than my sister did at this stage," she pressed. "Every pregnancy is different," he said, already turning to scribble notes on her chart. "You're young, healthy, and everything looks normal. Relax. This one's going to be easy." She nodded, but the knot in her stomach didn't ease. It tightened. By the 6th month, her back ached constantly. She felt heavy in ways that didn't make sense. Sometimes when she lay still at night, it was as if something inside her shifted to one side, pulling, stretching. James tried to be supportive, but he didn't understand. "You're just nervous," he said one evening, gently rubbing her shoulders. "My sister had twins, and she was in bed for the last 3 months. You're still up walking around. You're fine." But she didn't feel fine. Then came the night in December, cold with sleet tapping gently at the windows, when she woke gasping, gripping the edge of the bed. Her nightgown was soaked. Something had changed. She was only 7.5 months along. At the hospital, the nurses moved quickly. Evelyn barely remembered being wheeled into the delivery room. Everything blurred. Bright lights, beeping machines, the press of hands. And then, the sound of crying. Just one voice. She waited for the second cry, but it never came. Dr. Cohen later told her she delivered a healthy baby boy. 7 pounds, 2 ounces, strong lungs. She should be proud. She'd done well. She asked if there had been anything else. Another fetus, even a trace. He hesitated for a second too long. There was some excess tissue, nothing abnormal, just a bit of embryonic matter. We took care of it. What does that mean? He smiled as if trying to shoo away a shadow. It means you have a beautiful, healthy son. Rest now. You'll need your strength. But Evelyn didn't rest. That night, while little Thomas Whitaker slept swaddled beside her, she stared at the ceiling with wide, sleepless eyes, haunted not by what she had, but by what might have been. Evelyn didn't speak much in the days following the birth. Visitors came and went, cooing over baby Thomas, bringing pastel blankets and rattles shaped like little animals. James beamed with pride as he introduced their son to his co-workers, to the pastor, to the nosy neighbor from across the street. Everyone said the same things. He's perfect. You must be so proud. What a strong little guy. Evelyn smiled politely, said all the right things, but inside she felt hollow, like something had been taken from her that no one else could see. The nurses were kind, but hurried. The maternity ward was small, underfunded, and overworked. One nurse, a younger woman named May, paused one night while checking Evelyn's vitals. "You're awfully quiet," she said gently. "Most new moms can't stop talking about their babies." Evelyn hesitated, then said in a whisper, "Did they tell you what else they found?" May blinked. "What do you mean?" "The tissue," Evelyn said. "Dr. Cohen said there was something else, something they removed." May's face shifted, uncertain, professional. "I'm sure if it were anything important, he'd have said more. Try to focus on healing, okay? You've got a beautiful boy." That word again. Beautiful. As if that one word could erase the ache behind her ribs. 2 days later, Evelyn was discharged and sent home with Thomas, swaddled tightly in her arms. James drove carefully, hands at 10 and 2, glancing over every few minutes to smile at his son. The sun was out, cold and sharp, and snow dusted the edges of the road. Everything outside the car looked like a fresh start. Inside, Evelyn stared out the window, silent. Back home, she moved through the early days of motherhood in a haze, feeding, changing, rocking Thomas to sleep. He was a calm baby, rarely cried, and took to nursing easily. People kept telling her how lucky she was. But at night, when the house was quiet and James was snoring softly beside her, Evelyn lay awake, heart pounding with questions she couldn't silence. Why had no one taken her instincts seriously? Why had the doctor dismissed her so quickly? Why did it feel like, despite everything, someone was missing? One evening, while folding laundry in the nursery, she found herself standing over Thomas's crib, watching him sleep. His tiny chest rose and fell, his lips pursed in a faint, dreaming pout. For a moment, Evelyn imagined another crib beside his. Empty. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried since the hospital, but her throat tightened and a single tear slid down her cheek without permission. As the months passed, she didn't bring it up again. Not to James, not to Dr. Cohen, not to anyone. It was easier to let it blur into the fog of postpartum recovery, to focus on the boy in her arms rather than the shadow that hovered behind him. But some nights when Thomas stirred in his sleep or whimpered into the dark, Evelyn would tiptoe in and whisper to him, a line from her dream she didn't fully understand. "It's okay. I know you weren't alone in there." Tom Whitaker grew up quietly, the kind of boy who observed the world more than he participated in it. He was not frail nor particularly shy, but there was a certain stillness to him that neighbors commented on, an old soul kind of attentiveness that made it seem as if he were always listening to something they could not hear. Evelyn sometimes watched him playing in the yard, spinning a toy train in circles, and she could swear that he paused at certain moments to listen, not to the wind or the birds, but to some presence she could not see. From an early age, Tom seemed to have a companion the rest of the family could never see. He called him Jamie. Sometimes he would whisper to the empty corner of his room, adjusting an imaginary blanket over Jamie, or speak softly when the family was gathered around the kitchen table. Jamie said it's okay, Tom would tell his mother, almost as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Evelyn didn't correct him. There was something in the way he spoke, a seriousness that gave her pause. She often wondered if Jamie was a figment of imagination, a coping mechanism, or something else entirely. School life was largely uneventful, though Tom was always an introspective child. He performed well academically, but had trouble connecting with some of the other boys, preferring the company of books or quiet games over sports or roughhousing. Teachers praised his intelligence, but sometimes questioned his social tendencies. Evelyn tried to comfort herself with the thought that each child develops differently, but deep down she remembered her uneasy feelings from the pregnancy. There was always a flicker of worry she couldn't shake. Around the age of 6, a small lump appeared between Tom's shoulder blades. At first it was barely noticeable, a gentle rise beneath the skin that only she seemed to detect. Evelyn mentioned it to the pediatrician during a routine checkup. The doctor, a younger man eager to reassure her, examined it briefly, palpated the small bump, and declared it a harmless lipoma. "Nothing to worry about," he said with a casual smile. "It's common in children. Monitor it over time, but it's not abnormal." Evelyn wanted to press further, to demand more testing or imaging, but the clinic was crowded, the doctor already moving on to the next patient. The subtle dismissal gnawed at her conscience, but she did what many parents in similar situations did. She let it go. "We'll just watch it," she told herself. And she watched nervously as her son continued to grow. Even as Tom's body grew and the lump remained small, his attachment to Jamie persisted. Some nights Evelyn could hear him speaking quietly from his room, the cadence of his words soft and deliberate. "Jamie's cold," he'd whisper. "We need to move him closer." Sometimes she swore she heard a faint rustling, as if another presence were shifting under the covers of her imagination. Or perhaps something more. It was during these formative years that the first seeds of what would later become a long-standing mystery were planted. The combination of the small, persistent lump on his back, his unusual behavior, speaking to an unseen companion, and Evelyn's lingering maternal instincts all threaded together, creating an uneasy sense that the story of Thomas Whitaker and the shadow of Jamie was only beginning. As the years passed, Tom's behavior continued to intrigue and sometimes unsettle Evelyn. He remained an exceptionally quiet child, thoughtful to a degree that seemed beyond his age. Occasionally, he would wake in the middle of the night, standing at the side of his bed, staring at a corner of the room, speaking in a voice so soft that Evelyn could barely make out the words. "Jamie wants to play," he would murmur, or "Jamie says it's not safe yet." Evelyn, standing in the doorway, would often catch her breath, feeling the same knot in her stomach she had felt during her pregnancy. She never intervened, never questioned him aloud. Instead, she would watch, anxious, and hope that it was simply the imagination of a lonely child. Tom also began experiencing recurring dreams that left him unsettled in ways even he could not describe. In these dreams, he was trapped in a small, dark space, unable to move, while another presence, faint but unmistakably there, watched over him silently. At times he would wake in a cold sweat, hands pressed over his back, murmuring the name Jamie into the darkness. Evelyn sometimes heard these whispers from the hallway. She felt a twinge of fear, not for herself, but for what it might mean for her son. She kept journals during these years, scribbling down observations and concerns in the quiet hours after bedtime, but she never shared them with anyone. During routine pediatric visits, Evelyn occasionally brought up the small lump on Tom's back, which had remained largely unchanged but never fully disappeared. Each time the doctors would reassure her. "It's just fatty tissue," one would say. "Many children have harmless lumps like this. Nothing to worry about." Yet Evelyn couldn't shake the unease in her gut. She had been dismissed before, once, with her own pregnancy, the nagging sense that something important was overlooked. Now she felt a mounting tension that perhaps history was repeating itself, even if Tom seemed otherwise healthy. Tom, for his part, had begun internalizing a sense of secrecy around Jamie. He rarely spoke about the companion to friends at school, and he grew increasingly private with his thoughts. But Evelyn noticed subtle behaviors that made her pause. The way he would adjust his shirt over the lump in the mirror, or how he sometimes touched the exact spot on his back when he thought no one was watching. It was as if he sensed, on some level, that there was more to the story of his body than the doctors had explained. Despite her anxiety, Evelyn tried to focus on the ordinary joys of motherhood. She cherished Thomas's achievements, his quiet curiosity, and the moments when he would finally laugh freely. But even in those moments, she never forgot the intangible weight she carried, a maternal instinct that told her the story was not yet complete. She kept a careful watch over him, never voicing her deepest fears, and silently resolved to be present for every sign, every shift, every whispered word that might reveal the truth lurking just beneath the surface. By the time Thomas Whitaker reached the age of 10, the groundwork for the mysteries to come was fully laid. The persistent, small lump, the whispers to an unseen presence, and a mother's instinctive concern formed an invisible thread. These threads, Evelyn knew, even if she could not yet articulate it, would one day converge in a revelation that would change their lives forever. By the time Thomas Whitaker entered his teenage years, the quiet boy Evelyn had watched grow into a thoughtful child had begun to change in ways both subtle and unsettling. The lump on his back, once small and barely noticeable, had grown over the years, rising slightly beneath the skin between his shoulder blades. Though it still did not hurt, it had become firm to the touch, a constant reminder of something lurking beneath. Evelyn noticed him shifting his posture frequently, tugging at his shirt or rubbing his back when he thought no one was watching. High school brought new pressures, a new rhythm, and the challenge of blending into a social world that did not always understand those who were different. Tom remained reserved, preferring books and quiet hobbies to sports or large gatherings. His teachers often praised his intelligence, but noted his occasional absence in thought, as if he were somewhere else entirely. In truth, he often was, listening to Jamie, the unseen companion who had never truly left him. The whispers, once playful and childlike, had grown more insistent, more commanding in his mind. Evelyn watched from the sidelines, both proud and worried. She sensed the growing weight on Tom's shoulders, not just the physical lump, but the invisible one that came with being aware of something he could not explain. Some nights she would find him standing in his room, hands pressed to the middle of his back, eyes closed, muttering softly, "Jamie says not yet. Wait." She had learned long ago not to intervene, but the maternal instinct to protect him gnawed at her nonetheless. At one point, she finally decided to take him to another doctor, a pediatric surgeon recommended by a friend. The office was modern, bright, and smelled faintly of antiseptic and polished floors, a stark contrast to the small, crowded clinic where she had first sought reassurance years ago. The doctor, Dr. Fields, examined the lump with clinical detachment, pressing and palpating, then looking at the imaging results. He reassured Evelyn and Tom that it was most likely still just a lipoma, harmless and slow growing. "We'll keep an eye on it," he said. "If it starts changing rapidly, we'll explore other options. But there's nothing urgent now." Though the words were meant to soothe, Evelyn left the office with a deep, uneasy feeling she could not shake. The same knot she had felt during her pregnancy had returned, tied tight and insistent. She began keeping meticulous notes, observing the lump size, Tom's postures, the whispers she sometimes overheard, and the strange, subtle shifts in his demeanor. She recorded the dreams he described, the ones filled with dark spaces and unseen watchers, scribbling them into a leather-bound journal she kept tucked away in her bedside drawer. Meanwhile, Tom struggled with the psychological weight of knowing something was not quite ordinary about him. He found himself excusing his behaviors at school, feigning interest in imaginary homework assignments to explain absences from social activities, or quietly withdrawing when others would ask questions he could not answer. Jamie, his silent companion, had become more than just a friend. Jamie was a constant presence in his mind, offering guidance, reassurance, and at times issuing stern warnings. Tom had grown to fear that anyone discovering Jamie's existence would think him strange, unstable, or worse. Despite the internal struggle, there were moments of normal teenage life. Tom found solace in drawing, music, and long walks in the nearby woods with Frank Dalton, the Whitakers' friendly neighbor, who often served as a surrogate uncle figure. Frank, with his easygoing humor and attentive ear, never asked about the lump, never questioned Tom's quiet ways, and allowed him the space to be himself. For a while, this companionship provided a balance between the pressures of adolescence and the mysteries growing beneath his skin. By the time Tom reached 17, the lump had become undeniable, no longer something that could be ignored or mistaken for a minor anomaly. It pressed firmly under his skin, and though it caused no pain, it interfered with sleep and movement. He wore loose clothing to conceal it, avoiding gym class whenever possible. Evelyn urged him gently to consider further examination, but financial constraints and a healthcare system that often made the process arduous weighed heavily on their minds. Insurance approvals, multiple referrals, and the lingering sense that nothing urgent had been found in previous visits kept them in a frustrating limbo. Yet through it all, the undercurrent of unease, the whispers, the dreams, and Evelyn's intuitive knowledge that something extraordinary was at play, continued to grow. It was a slow, simmering tension, the kind that pulls a person inward, shaping character, decisions, and destiny. Little did they know that the years of silence, observation, and subtle warning signs were merely preparing them for a revelation that would change everything about Tom Whitaker's life and the life he had shared with Jamie, the brother he would not meet for decades. As Thomas Whitaker moved beyond high school and into early adulthood, The quiet boy who had once been so introspective became a young man grappling with both physical and emotional changes. The lump on his back, ever present since childhood, had grown slowly but noticeably over the years. Still painless, it had become firm and slightly uneven, causing him to adjust his posture constantly as if the lump itself demanded attention. While most would dismiss such a condition as minor, Tom carried an unshakable awareness that something was not ordinary about it. His career as a mechanical engineer in Baton Rouge offered stability, but it also demanded long hours in front of blueprints, machinery, and spreadsheets. Tom thrived intellectually, yet socially he remained reserved. He preferred solitude and quiet hobbies, tinkering with small engines in his garage, sketching mechanical designs, or playing guitar late into the night. Carol, who he would meet in his early 20s and eventually marry, was drawn to his thoughtful demeanor and the intensity of his gaze. She quickly became his anchor in a world where he often felt out of place. Despite the comfort Carol brought, Tom could not ignore the sensations within his own body. The lump had grown denser, occasionally creating a dull stiffness in his shoulders and upper back. Simple tasks, reaching overhead, lifting tools, or even leaning forward at his desk, sometimes caused discomfort that was impossible to ignore. Yet when he visited doctors, he was met with the same familiar reassurance. It's benign, just fatty tissue, nothing urgent. Each visit left him frustrated, understanding that the medical system prioritized clear, measurable threats over subtle warning signs. Insurance approvals were slow, referrals tedious, and the cost of additional imaging a continual obstacle. It was during these years that the whispers in Tom's mind, the subtle voice of Jamie, became more pronounced. He found himself hesitating before making decisions, not because he doubted himself, but because Jamie seemed to offer caution or guidance that Tom could neither explain nor ignore. At first, he worried this was a sign of mental instability, a symptom of stress or isolation. But over time, he came to accept Jamie as an inseparable part of his consciousness, one that had been with him for as long as he could remember. Carol noticed the change. "Sometimes you talk to yourself too quietly," she said one evening as they unpacked boxes in their new apartment. "I don't mean to pry, but is there someone else in your head?" Tom laughed nervously, waving her off. "Just thinking aloud," he replied. But he knew the truth. Jamie had been with him his entire life, guiding him silently, waiting for the moment he could finally understand. Financial constraints and the limitations of the American healthcare system continued to delay serious investigation of the lump. Tom was conscientious about his work and obligations. He was not the type to request time off unnecessarily. Combined with the insurance hurdles and repeated assurances from doctors that nothing was urgent, he postponed action. Yet the unease persisted, a gnawing feeling that something essential was being overlooked. This awareness shaped his personality: cautious, meticulous, quietly vigilant. One evening, Tom confided in Carol about the dreams he had had since childhood. "I keep dreaming about Jamie, about being trapped in darkness and hearing a voice that isn't mine," he said. She listened carefully, neither dismissing nor judging, but her eyes reflected concern. She gently suggested that perhaps it was time to seek a specialist, someone who could truly understand what was happening. "Even if it's nothing dangerous," she said softly, "you deserve answers, and we deserve peace of mind." Tom considered her words seriously. It was the first time he had thought of actively pursuing more than routine checkups. Deep down, he knew that the situation was unusual and that ignoring it any longer might be a mistake. But he also feared the obstacles, the paperwork, the approvals, the financial burden. And somewhere beneath it all, he feared what they might discover. He did not know that the years of subtle signs, the whispers, the dreams, and the persistent lump were leading to a revelation that would challenge everything he had believed about himself and about Jamie, the silent companion he had carried for nearly 2 decades. By the time he turned 27, Tom realized he could no longer postpone action. The lump had reached a size and firmness that could not be ignored, and the internal voice that had guided him for so long demanded recognition. With Carol by his side, he began researching specialists, preparing himself for the possibility that his life, as he had always known it, was about to change in ways he could not yet imagine. By the time Thomas Whitaker was approaching 30, the lump on his back had become impossible to ignore. Though it had never caused him acute pain, it had grown steadily over the years, becoming firm and somewhat irregular in shape. Every day it reminded him of something hidden, something that had been silently shaping his life for decades. The whisper of Jamie, his lifelong companion, had become a persistent undercurrent in his thoughts, urging caution, warning, and occasionally commanding his attention. Tom felt the weight of both the physical and invisible presences pressing on him simultaneously. Carol had noticed the toll it was taking. He adjusted his posture constantly, rubbed his shoulders unconsciously, and sometimes flinched at the slightest pressure on his back. She gently suggested he see a specialist, someone who might be able to provide clarity beyond the cursory examinations he had endured throughout his youth. At first, Tom hesitated, citing the barriers that had always frustrated them: insurance approvals, referrals, and the ever-present cost of specialist consultations. "It's probably nothing," he said, but deep down he knew that the nothing he had been told all his life might not be the whole truth. After a particularly restless night, Tom finally agreed to schedule an appointment. They drove together to Houston Memorial, a hospital known for its experienced physicians and advanced imaging equipment. The building itself was imposing, a combination of glass and concrete that reflected the bright Texas sun. Inside, the sterile scent of antiseptic mixed with the low hum of fluorescent lights and the soft murmur of nurses and patients. Tom felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach as they approached the reception desk. Dr. Charles Monroe, a distinguished surgeon specializing in unusual and rare conditions, greeted them personally. His presence was calm yet commanding, the kind of authority that immediately instilled trust. "I understand you've been dealing with a persistent mass for quite some time," he said, glancing at Tom's chart. "Let's take a thorough look and see what we're working with." Tom followed him to a private examination room. As Dr. Monroe examined the lump, his hands were precise and deliberate, probing the tissue while maintaining a level of attentiveness that Tom had rarely encountered in previous doctors. "It's firm and somewhat irregular," Dr. Monroe noted, frowning slightly. "Not typical for a standard lipoma. We'll need imaging, MRI, and possibly a CT scan to understand what's happening beneath the surface." Evelyn's intuition seemed to echo in Tom's mind, a lingering sense of unease that had always guided her during his childhood. The doctor's words validated what Tom had felt all along. Something had been overlooked, and it was time to confront it. As Dr. Monroe explained the procedure for imaging and the potential need for biopsy or surgical intervention, he also offered gentle advice. Even if this turns out to be benign, the size and consistency warrant further investigation. If anything changes rapidly or causes discomfort, don't wait. Early detection can make all the difference. Tom nodded, listening carefully. For the first time, he felt a sense of relief intertwined with apprehension. He had spent so long living with uncertainty and subtle warnings from Jamie that he had come to understand the value of professional attention. At the same time, he feared what the imaging might reveal. Was it still just a lipoma? Or could the persistent presence he had sensed for so many years, Jamie, be connected to something far more extraordinary? The imaging process began the following week. Tom lay on the MRI table, ears pressed to the machine as it whirred and hummed. His body tense, yet anticipating answers he had sought for decades. Carol held his hand before leaving the room, whispering reassurance. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together," she said. In the days that followed, Dr. Monroe carefully analyzed the images. His expression grew increasingly thoughtful as he reviewed the scans, noting the unusual internal structure. He called Tom and Carol back in for a consultation, his tone measured but serious. "This is not what we typically see in lipomas," he began. "The mass has internal components, structures that resemble tissue development beyond what is expected in a simple fatty lump. We need to consider a surgical exploration to fully understand it." Tom felt a strange mixture of fear, anticipation, and resolve. The path he had avoided for so long, the path of uncertainty, financial hurdles, and the opaque bureaucracy of healthcare, was finally leading him to a confrontation with the truth. Jamie's quiet guidance, the whisper that had followed him since childhood, seemed almost tangible now, urging him forward toward a revelation that would change everything he had ever known about himself. The following week, Thomas Whitaker arrived early at Houston Memorial for the scheduled imaging. The morning sun streamed through the large windows of the radiology department, bouncing off the polished floors and sterile walls. Tom felt the familiar knot of tension tighten in his stomach, a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. He had endured years of uncertainty, subtle warnings, and unexplained sensations in his own body. And now he was finally taking the first concrete steps to uncover the truth. Carol accompanied him, holding his hand as they entered the MRI suite. The room was narrow, illuminated with soft fluorescent light, and filled with the steady hum of the machine. Tom lay on the moving table, ears pressed against the cold plastic of the headrest as the MRI began its cycle. The rhythmic thumping and whirring were strangely comforting, a mechanical heartbeat that seemed to echo the anxious rhythm in his own chest. He closed his eyes, letting his mind wander, and for the first time in decades, he allowed himself to imagine what could lie beneath the surface, what Jamie had been silently guarding, guiding, and perhaps protecting all his life. When the imaging was complete, Dr. Charles Monroe analyzed the results with meticulous care. Tom and Carol returned to the consultation room, where Dr. Monroe sat with a calm but serious expression. "I've reviewed the scans," he began, "and what I'm seeing is unusual. The mass on your back contains internal structures that are not consistent with a typical lipoma. There are components that resemble organized tissue, possibly bone, hair, or other differentiated cells." Tom's heart thumped louder at the words, a mix of disbelief and curiosity. "Bone? Hair? What does that mean?" he asked, trying to steady his voice. Dr. Monroe leaned forward slightly. It suggests that we may be dealing with something far more complex than a standard benign growth. I recommend a surgical exploration to fully understand what we are seeing. This is rare, but it can reveal tissue development that has occurred silently for decades. Carol squeezed Tom's hand, her gaze steady and reassuring. Whatever it is, we'll face it together, she said softly. Tom nodded, taking a deep breath. The familiar voice of Jamie, once merely a whisper in the corners of his mind, seemed to resonate more clearly now. It was as if the presence he had carried all these years was finally leading him toward discovery and understanding. Over the next few days, Dr. Monroe explained the procedure in detail. The surgery would allow him to observe the internal structures directly and remove any tissue necessary for further analysis. Tom learned about the potential risks: bleeding, infection, nerve damage. But he also understood that delaying could result in unknown complications. The careful balance of fear and determination grew heavier with each conversation. During a quiet evening at home, Tom confided in Carol about the dreams he had carried since childhood. I keep seeing that dark space, he said, voice low. And Jamie is there, watching, waiting, sometimes whispering. I've always felt he's been trying to tell me something, and now it feels like we're getting closer. Carol listened, her eyes soft with empathy. It sounds like he's been guiding you, she said. Maybe it's time to finally understand what he's been protecting you from, or what he is. As they prepared for the surgical consultation, Tom reflected on the years of subtle signs he had ignored or been dismissed. The persistent lump, the dreams, the whispers of Jamie, and Evelyn's lingering intuition had all been warning him that something extraordinary was beneath the surface. Now the medical imaging had confirmed that there was more than anyone had anticipated, a structured presence that was atypical, puzzling, and profoundly significant. He also thought about the limitations of the healthcare system that had kept him waiting for answers. The delays caused by insurance approvals, the repeated reassurances of nothing urgent, and the financial barriers had all prolonged the uncertainty. Yet despite these obstacles, he had persisted, guided by instinct, maternal intuition, and the subtle, unwavering voice of Jamie. It was a lesson in vigilance, in listening to one's body, and in refusing to accept incomplete answers. By the time the consultation ended, Tom and Carol were fully prepared to move forward. The MRI had revealed the first tangible signs that this was no ordinary growth. The lump was far more complex than anyone had imagined, and the upcoming surgery would finally provide the answers they had sought for decades. In the quiet moments as they left the hospital, Tom felt a mixture of dread and anticipation. For the first time in his life, he felt that he was standing on the threshold of a revelation that could redefine everything he had known about himself and about the silent companion who had shared his life all along. The days leading up to the surgery were heavy with anticipation. Thomas Whitaker found himself caught in a delicate balance of fear, curiosity, and an almost reverent anticipation of the unknown. Each night he lay awake in the dim glow of the bedroom lamp, tracing his fingers along the raised lump between his shoulder blades. He had lived with it for decades, first a small, almost forgettable presence, now an undeniable and persistent reminder that there was more to his body than he had ever imagined. Carol stayed close by, her presence steady and comforting. She organized his schedule, coordinated with the hospital for preoperative instructions, and quietly insisted he attend to the mundane details, fasting, medication schedules, and arranging time off work. She noticed his occasional tremors, the way he would hold his breath when standing, as if bracing himself for a revelation he both feared and longed to understand. Tom also began mentally revisiting the whispers of Jamie, the companion who had been with him for as long as he could remember. In quiet moments, he would sit in his favorite chair, eyes closed, letting the memory of the childhood whispers wash over him. Jamie had always been gentle but firm, present but unobtrusive. Now, with the surgery looming, that presence felt different, impatient, urging, as if the silent voice could sense that the moment of truth had finally arrived. Evelyn, who had traveled from Georgia to be with him, carried her own tension. Watching her son prepare for a procedure that might reveal something extraordinary brought back all the fears she had felt during his childhood, and even the subtle instincts she had sensed during her own pregnancy. She held his childhood journal in her hands, flipping through the pages where she had chronicled his dreams, the small oddities in his behavior, and her own unspoken fears. Each page told a story she had been too cautious to share with anyone, but now it felt vital to have those memories present. Meanwhile, Dr. Charles Monroe prepared meticulously for the surgery. He reviewed the MRI scans repeatedly, consulting with colleagues to discuss the unusual structures inside the mass. His experience had taught him that rare anomalies could be overlooked if the proper care and attention were not given, and he made it a point to anticipate any complications. The procedure would not be straightforward. Every step required precision and awareness of the unexpected. As the surgery day approached, Tom found himself wrestling with a mixture of dread and resolve. He thought of the decades of uncertainty, the subtle signals he had ignored, and the quiet persistence of Jamie guiding him through it all. The anticipation was accompanied by a profound sense of vulnerability. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine what might be revealed. The fear of discovering something extraordinary and possibly unsettling was tempered by a growing recognition that understanding was worth confronting that fear. Carol tried to anchor him in the present. She reminded him to breathe, to rest, and to focus on the certainty of their partnership. "We've faced every challenge together," she said softly one evening. "We'll face this too. No matter what we find, you're not alone." Tom nodded, squeezing her hand, grateful for her calm resolve in the face of his apprehension. In the quiet of their home, he packed a small bag with the essentials for the hospital stay, a few changes of clothes, his favorite book, and a small journal he had begun keeping again, documenting the strange dreams and persistent whispers that had accompanied him for years. This journal was now a record not just of mysteries, but of guidance, intuition, and the life lessons he had gleaned from a presence no one else could see. On the eve of the surgery, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Tom felt a strange calm wash over him. The decades of avoidance, fear, and uncertainty had led to this moment. Jamie's whisper in his mind was quieter now, but insistent. "It's time." For the first time, Tom was ready to confront not just the lump that had shadowed his life, but the truth that had existed alongside him all these years. And though fear still lingered, it was balanced by the deep, undeniable sense that the answer waiting in the operating room would finally bring clarity, closure, and perhaps a new beginning. The day of the surgery arrived with a crisp, clear morning, that contrasted sharply with the storm of nerves Thomas Whitaker carried inside him. Carol drove him to Houston Memorial, keeping a steady hand on his as they navigated the quiet streets of the city. He had dressed in loose, comfortable clothing, and his bag contained only essentials: a journal, a worn paperback, and the small photograph of his mother, Evelyn, that he had carried for years. The lump on his back, long a silent and constant presence, now loomed as a tangible threshold between decades of uncertainty and the revelation that awaited him. As they entered the hospital, the sterile smell of antiseptic and the faint hum of machinery greeted them. Nurses guided them through corridors, offering warm smiles and soft words of encouragement. Tom felt a peculiar combination of tension and calm. The years of avoidance and postponement had brought him to this singular moment. For the first time, he allowed himself to fully imagine what lay beneath the surface, though he did not dare speculate on the full truth. Dr. Charles Monroe met them at the preoperative suite. His composed demeanor and authoritative voice provided a grounding force for Tom and Carol. "Today we'll get definitive answers," Dr. Monroe said, reviewing the imaging one last time before the procedure. "We're prepared for the unexpected, but we will take every precaution." He gave Tom a reassuring nod. "You're in good hands." Tom swallowed, nodding back, and felt Jamie's quiet presence in his mind as if offering encouragement. "You've been ready for this your entire life." The anesthesia team entered, explaining the process with precision and care. As Tom was moved to the operating table, the sensation of the cold metal beneath him and the gentle tug of the straps heightened his awareness of his own vulnerability. Carol squeezed his hand one last time before stepping back, watching silently as he was prepped. The hum of monitors and the faint hiss of oxygen filled the room, a mechanical heartbeat that seemed to echo the pounding rhythm in his own chest. Once fully anesthetized, Tom's consciousness slipped into a gray, hovering awareness. Though in fragments of dreamlike clarity, he sensed the presence of Jamie beside him. The faint voice he had carried for decades seemed closer now, more insistent, almost guiding him toward the answers he had sought. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he understood that the barrier between him and the truth had narrowed to mere moments. Dr. Monroe made the first incision with steady hands, his team moving with silent precision. The room was a symphony of careful motion, the whir of suction devices, the soft scrape of surgical instruments, and the occasional directive whispered across the sterile field. Each layer of tissue revealed to the surgeons confirmed their expectations of complexity. The mass was dense, far more than a simple lipoma, and its organization was peculiar, structured, almost deliberate in the way it had developed. As they proceeded, Dr. Monroe paused, squinting at the exposed tissue. "This is unusual," he murmured to the attending nurse. His voice carried a mixture of scientific curiosity and restrained astonishment. "There are formations here that resemble differentiated tissues, bone, strands of hair, perhaps other cellular structures that shouldn't be present." The room grew quieter, the assistants exchanging brief, knowing glances. Tom, in his anesthetized state, seemed to sense the significance of the moment. In a fragment of consciousness, he felt a pull, a subtle, inexplicable sensation, connecting him to something that had always been there, but never fully revealed. Jamie's presence felt almost tangible, a guiding hand ushering him toward a revelation that would redefine his understanding of self, of life, and of the silent companion who had existed alongside him for decades. The surgical team worked meticulously, carefully dissecting layers to expose the core of the mass. Each discovery deepened the tension in the room. What should have been a routine procedure for a benign growth was anything but ordinary. Instruments paused over irregular formations, and Dr. Monroe adjusted his focus repeatedly, documenting each unusual detail. The anticipation was palpable, a quiet intensity that seemed to bind everyone present in a shared understanding that the mass contained something extraordinary, something beyond medical convention. As the first hints of structured tissue became apparent, Dr. Monroe's expression hardened into a mask of professional fascination. He whispered again, this time to himself, "I've never seen anything quite like this." The team followed his gaze, observing the intricate organization beneath the surface, recognizing that the layers of matter were not random, but displayed characteristics of deliberate formation and internal complexity that defied conventional explanation. Even in the depth of anesthesia, Tom's mind registered the gravity of the moment. The years of dreams, whispers, and intuitive warnings were converging in this singular instance. He did not yet understand what would be revealed, but he knew that the truth was about to emerge. A truth that would illuminate not only the mystery of the lump itself, but also the silent presence, the companion he had carried all his life. As Dr. Charles Monroe and his surgical team carefully continued to dissect the mass, the room's atmosphere grew increasingly tense, charged with a quiet anticipation. The unusual tissue formations beneath Thomas Whitaker's skin were becoming more evident, complex, structured, and unlike anything typically seen in a simple lipoma. Each layer exposed another layer of astonishing organization, suggesting the presence of differentiated cells, some forming structures reminiscent of bone, hair, and other embryonic tissue. Dr. Monroe's brow furrowed as he examined a particularly dense area. "This isn't just a tumor," he muttered to his assistant, a note of both astonishment and caution in his voice. "We may be looking at something extremely rare." The surgical team paused for a moment, their collective focus sharpening. The mass, it seemed, was not random growth. It was almost deliberate, arranged in a way that hinted at a developmental process beyond standard medical experience. Thomas, unconscious on the operating table, seemed to hover in a hazy awareness. A fragment of his mind reached out, a sensation that had been building over decades now, coalescing into clarity. The presence of Jamie, the companion who had been with him since childhood, speaking softly in whispers, guiding and cautioning, felt solid, tangible. It was as though Jamie had been waiting for this very moment, ready to reveal the secret that had lain dormant for years. Dr. Monroe carefully cleared the last layer of tissue, revealing the core of the mass. Gasps filled the room as the extraordinary sight came into view. Embedded within the mass were structures unmistakably reminiscent of human anatomy, small bones that resembled vertebrae, tiny teeth in clusters of hair. The density of the tissue, the arrangement of these features, and the overall formation could not be explained by a typical tumor. The realization settled over the surgical team. They were observing a phenomenon so rare it had been documented only a handful of times in medical history. This is a fetus in fetu," Dr. Monroe finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked around the room, eyes wide, and continued, "A parasitic twin, a twin that, for whatever reason, stopped developing in utero, and became incorporated into the host body, incredibly rare, fewer than 200 documented cases worldwide. Carol, waiting anxiously in the observation room, was unaware of the magnitude of what was happening. She only knew that Dr. Monroe had called for her to be prepared for discussion after the surgery. Her mind imagined every possibility, but nothing could have prepared her for the extraordinary truth that had been hidden for decades in the body of the man she loved. Back in the operating room, Dr. Monroe's team carefully removed the mass, documenting and preserving the tissue for further pathological analysis. Every step was precise, deliberate, and respectful of the anomaly they were encountering. The surgical field was filled with an almost reverent silence, punctuated only by the soft beeps of monitors and the careful clinks of instruments. For Thomas, even under anesthesia, a deep sense of recognition washed over him. The lump, which had been a constant presence in his life, was now revealed as more than just a mass. It was the physical manifestation of Jamie, the twin who had been incorporated into his body before birth. A lifetime of whispers, dreams, and instinctual warnings made sense for the first time. What had once been intangible, mysterious, and quietly guiding him was now concrete, undeniable, and scientifically extraordinary. Dr. Monroe stepped back, surveying the mass in its entirety. "This explains a lot," he murmured almost to himself. The meticulous arrangement of tissue, the presence of differentiated structures, and the lack of malignancy all pointed to a parasitic twin, a twin that had shared Thomas's life silently, influencing his experiences and intuition in subtle, profound ways. The gravity of the discovery was not lost on the surgical team. They understood that the implications went beyond medicine. They touched on the mysteries of life, identity, and the uncanny ways in which the human body can harbor secrets. The mass would undergo detailed pathological analysis, but already the surgical evidence had confirmed what Thomas had intuitively known all along. Jamie had been there, always shaping his life from within. As Thomas began the slow process of waking from anesthesia, he experienced a peculiar sensation of lightness. The pressure of decades had been lifted, and yet he felt a profound connection to the silent companion who had shared his body and life. Carol held his hand as he blinked awake, and for the first time, he felt the magnitude of what had been revealed. Jamie's presence, once a whisper in his mind, was now understood as a tangible part of his history, a secret companion whose existence had quietly guided, protected, and shaped him. The team prepared Thomas for recovery, carefully monitoring his vital signs and ensuring the procedure's success. The room, though still professional and clinical, was filled with an unspoken sense of awe at the rare phenomenon they had witnessed. It was a moment that would remain etched in their memories, a convergence of medical precision, human intuition, and the extraordinary hidden within an ordinary life. Thomas Whitaker slowly regained consciousness in the quiet, softly lit recovery room. The sterile scent of antiseptic was familiar, but now it carried a new weight, the weight of revelation. The surgical team had successfully removed the mass, the extraordinary parasitic twin that had existed within him for 62 years. Even as his body ached from the procedure, a strange lightness filled his chest, a sensation of liberation mingled with the reverence of knowing that a profound secret had finally been unveiled. Carol sat by his bedside, holding his hand and brushing a stray strand of hair from his forehead. "You're awake," she whispered, relief evident in her voice. "How are you feeling?" Thomas took a deep breath, wincing slightly as the stitches pulled against his skin. "Strange," he said softly. "I feel lighter, but it's like a part of me is missing, and I didn't even know it was there." In the days following the surgery, the hospital became a place of quiet reflection. Nurses monitored his vitals, ensured his pain was managed, and offered gentle guidance as he began the slow process of movement and recovery. But it was the internal emotional journey that weighed heaviest on Thomas. For decades, he had carried a silent presence. Jamie, whose subtle guidance had shaped his life, his instincts, and even his decisions. That presence, once intangible, now had a physical manifestation. The reality was staggering, almost beyond comprehension. Dr. Charles Monroe visited regularly, reviewing preliminary findings and assuring Thomas that the mass had been entirely benign. "You were extraordinarily fortunate," he said with measured seriousness. "The structure we removed is rare, but it was contained. There is no malignancy. You are healthy." Even so, the discovery demanded more than medical assessment. There were questions of identity, of understanding how life could harbor such mysteries, and of confronting emotions that had no clear explanation. Thomas began keeping a journal once more, documenting his feelings, memories, and the sudden clarity that washed over him. He reflected on childhood dreams, the whispers of Jamie, and the strange instincts that had guided him through life. Each entry revealed a pattern of subtle signs he had long dismissed or feared. The recognition that he had carried a twin in his body all these years, quietly influencing him, evoked a deep sense of awe. It was not merely the shock of the medical revelation, but the understanding that his life had been shared, in a sense, from the very beginning. Carol remained a steady presence, listening and providing comfort without judgment. She acknowledged the strangeness of the situation, but her focus remained on supporting Thomas as he processed the truth. "It doesn't change who you are," she told him one evening as they watched the sun set over the city. "If anything, it shows how resilient you've been and how much you've carried all this time." Boom. Thomas nodded, absorbing the words, feeling a mixture of relief, grief, and gratitude. Even Evelyn arrived to witness her son's recovery. The years of maternal intuition that had guided her throughout Thomas's life had finally been validated. She wept quietly, holding his hand, the memories of dreams, observations, and subtle warnings flooding back in vivid clarity. "I knew," she whispered. "I always knew, even when everyone told me I was imagining things. I just didn't have proof until now." Thomas reached for her hand, understanding for the first time the depth of her insight and the quiet strength that had protected him before he could even recognize it. As the days progressed, the Whitaker family confronted the emotional implications of the discovery. Thomas spoke more openly about his dreams, his experiences with Jamie, and the strange sense of companionship that had shaped his decisions. Carol listened intently, and Evelyn added the context of maternal instinct and intuition. Each conversation offered clarity and validation, a collective acknowledgement of a mystery that had spanned generations. The hospital stay ended, and Thomas returned home. The familiar surroundings of his house, once ordinary, now felt infused with significance. Every creaking floorboard, every sunbeam through the window, and even the simple act of touching his back reminded him of the journey he had endured. The whispers of Jamie, once constant and guiding, were now replaced by memories of lessons learned, subtle nudges, and the understanding that he had never truly been alone. In the quiet evenings, Thomas sat with his journal, pen poised over paper, reflecting on the extraordinary revelation. For the first time, he allowed himself to fully process the mixture of awe, grief, relief, and gratitude that had been accumulating for decades. The mass that had silently shaped his life was gone, but its significance remained embedded in memory, intuition, and the knowledge that life often holds mysteries far beyond ordinary perception. Recovery continued, both physically and emotionally, as Thomas gradually integrated the truth of his parasitic twin into his understanding of self. Each day became a new opportunity to reconcile the years of whispers, subtle warnings, and unexplained instinct with the clarity provided by modern medicine. The knowledge that he had shared his life with Jamie did not diminish him. It enriched his understanding of human resilience, intuition, and the extraordinary complexity of existence. The days following Thomas Whitaker's return home from the hospital were a mixture of routine recovery and profound reflection. His body was healing, but his mind was consumed with questions that had waited decades for answers. The lump that had silently shared his life with him for 62 years was gone, and yet its presence lingered in memory and intuition. It was during this time that Evelyn arrived, traveling from Georgia to be with her son, bringing with her the weight of years of maternal instinct and unspoken knowledge. Evelyn entered the house quietly, carrying a small leather-bound folder. She placed it gently on the kitchen table, as though the contents were fragile, delicate, and sacred. "I think it's time you see this," she said softly, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Thomas looked at her, sensing the gravity of the moment. He nodded, sitting down, his journal already open on his lap. Carol stood nearby, offering silent support, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. Evelyn opened the folder, revealing a collection of old medical records, scribbled notes, and a faded letter from Dr. Cohen, the obstetrician who had delivered Thomas decades earlier. The records were sparse, but they held a single crucial note: excess tissue removed at birth. No further explanation provided. Patient healthy. Evelyn's hand shook slightly as she turned the pages. "I kept these all these years," she said. "I didn't have proof, only intuition. But now you know, and I think it's time you understood everything." Thomas leaned forward, absorbing every word. His mind raced, reconstructing memories of childhood dreams, whispered voices, and the persistent sense that he had never truly been alone. The folder contained references to the subtle irregularities noted in his infancy, the small but persistent lump, and the repeated reassurances from doctors that nothing serious was present. Yet read together, these fragments painted a story that resonated deeply with the experiences he had carried silently for decades. Dr. Charles Monroe had provided preliminary analysis from the tissue removed during surgery. The mass, he explained, contained structures remarkably similar to embryonic development: bones, hair, and even partially formed teeth. The team of pathologists had been meticulous in their examination, confirming that it was not malignant and that it had developed in a highly organized, structured manner, consistent with a rare phenomenon known as fetus in fetu. The term described a parasitic twin incorporated into the body of the host during gestation, a condition so rare that fewer than 200 cases had been documented worldwide. Thomas listened carefully as Evelyn explained the circumstances of her own pregnancy. the subtle signs she had sensed, and the dreams she had experienced. Dreams in which she envisioned two children, one visible and thriving, the other fading into obscurity. I always felt there was more, Evelyn said, tears welling in her eyes. Even when the doctors dismissed me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left behind, something I needed to protect. Thomas reached across the table, taking his mother's hand. The connection, forged over decades of unspoken awareness and maternal intuition, felt immediate, grounding, and deeply reassuring. Carol, sitting beside him, reflected on the confluence of intuition, science, and lived experience. She considered how often ordinary signs are overlooked, dismissed, or misinterpreted within the healthcare system. Years of subtle symptoms, financial limitations, and procedural delays had almost prevented Thomas from ever understanding the truth. The juxtaposition of scientific discovery and human intuition had finally converged in this singular moment, revealing a story far more extraordinary than any textbook could convey. Thomas felt a profound mixture of relief, awe, and melancholy. Relief that the mystery of the lump was resolved, awe at the extraordinary biological phenomenon that had shaped his life, and melancholy for the years of silent companionship he had shared with Jamie without knowing the truth. He realized that the whispers he had heard, the dreams that had guided him, and the instincts he had followed were all manifestations of a twin that had, in a sense, walked beside him from the very beginning. As the day progressed, Thomas, Evelyn, and Carol reviewed the pathology reports together. Every page reinforced the reality of the extraordinary event they had witnessed. Organized tissue, cellular differentiation, and signs of development that were startlingly human. There was no ambiguity. The mass had been parasitic twin, fully incorporated into Thomas's body for over 6 decades. Each finding was a testament to the complexity of life, the resilience of the human body, and the hidden stories that it can harbor silently for a lifetime. Sitting together that evening, Thomas allowed himself to speak aloud the words he had kept silent for decades. Jamie was real, he said softly, almost in disbelief. He was with me all this time, and now I understand why I felt the way I always have. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears as she nodded, the years of maternal intuition finally validated. Carol held his hand, a quiet witness to a revelation that defied explanation, yet was grounded in undeniable reality. In the quiet of the evening, the Whitaker family sat together, enveloped in the stillness of understanding. The past long hidden within the body and mind of Thomas had been revealed. The whispers, dreams, and intuition that had guided his life were now understood as evidence of Jamie's existence, a presence that had shaped his experiences, protected him, and remained inseparable from his very being until the day the truth could finally be acknowledged and embraced. In the days that followed, Thomas Whitaker settled into a new rhythm at home, where physical healing intertwined with profound emotional processing. The surgical procedure had removed the mass, but it had also removed a layer of uncertainty that had existed in his life for more than 6 decades. In its place arose a complex mixture of relief, curiosity, and an almost overwhelming sense of awe. For the first time, he was able to reflect fully on a life lived alongside an invisible presence, a companion who had guided him in subtle ways he had only now begun to understand. Evelyn remained a steady presence, providing both comfort and context. She recounted memories from Thomas's childhood, drawing connections between the whispers he had reported, the small behaviors that had puzzled teachers and neighbors, and the subtle intuitions that had shaped his decisions. Each story she told deepened Thomas's understanding, transforming memories he had previously dismissed as imagination into evidence of a silent, guiding twin. "I've always trusted my instincts," Evelyn said, her voice soft but firm. "And now you can see why. It wasn't just intuition, it was reality." Thomas nodded, gratitude and wonder mixing in his expression, feeling the weight of the revelation and the validation of his mother's insights. Carol, meanwhile, continued to provide practical support and emotional grounding. She encouraged Thomas to speak openly about the experience, to externalize the thoughts and feelings that had been kept secret for so long. Together, they revisited the journals Thomas had maintained over decades, the records of dreams, whispers, and internal guidance, and he began to connect these fragments with the pathological findings from the surgery. Every note, every sketch, every subtle recollection now fit into a larger narrative, revealing the extraordinary story that had unfolded silently alongside his everyday life. The family also spent time reflecting on the broader implications of Thomas's experience, particularly the interaction between human intuition and the medical system. Years of overlooked signs, delayed examinations, and procedural obstacles had allowed the lump to persist for decades. Yet the persistent awareness of Jamie, combined with Evelyn's maternal instincts, had guided Thomas to the answers he needed. The realization that vigilance, intuition, and careful observation could sometimes be as crucial as modern medical intervention became a point of profound discussion within the family. "This is a reminder," Evelyn said, "that we must listen to our bodies and our instincts, even when the world tells us everything is fine." As the days passed, Thomas also began processing the emotional weight of having shared his life with Jamie. The knowledge that he had never truly been alone, even in moments of isolation or doubt, was comforting, but it also carried a certain poignancy. For decades, he had navigated life with subtle guidance, internal voices, and protective instincts he had only recently understood. Grief mixed with gratitude as he considered the life of the twin who had never lived independently, yet whose presence had been inseparable from his own. The family held a quiet, informal ceremony one evening in their backyard. They had prepared a small box containing the remains of the Mass, now fully analyzed and preserved, and a few personal mementos representing Thomas's journey, his journals, childhood drawings, and a photograph of Evelyn from the early days of his life. Together they chose a spot beneath a tall pecan tree, a place of sunlight, shade, and a comforting sense of permanence. Thomas knelt in the soft grass, gently placing the box beneath the roots, whispering words he had carried silently for years. "You've been with me all this time, Yunan," he said. "Thank you for guiding me, for protecting me, and for being here when I couldn't see you. You can rest now." In the quiet that followed, Thomas felt a sense of closure. The emotional processing, the family reflections, and the act of laying the remains to rest provided a tangible endpoint to decades of uncertainty. He could now acknowledge Jamie's presence fully, recognize the impact it had had on his life, and integrate the experience into his understanding of self. The mix of awe, gratitude, and bittersweet sorrow left him with a way deeper appreciation for the resilience of the human spirit, the subtleties of intuition, and the extraordinary mysteries of life that can persist quietly alongside the ordinary. Evenings became moments of reflection. Thomas and Carol would sit together, reviewing old journals, talking about the journey, and discussing how to share their story responsibly with others, without sensationalism, but with honesty and depth. Evelyn would join them, adding context from her own perspective, emphasizing the importance of listening to instincts, observing subtle signs, and valuing the interplay between intuition and medical guidance. Through these discussions, Thomas began to understand that his life had been a remarkable convergence of science, intuition, and the extraordinary resilience of human perception. By the end of the week, the immediate emotional turbulence had subsided into a contemplative calm. Thomas's recovery, both physical and emotional, allowed him to integrate the experience fully. He carried with him a profound understanding of his own life, the unseen twin who had shaped it, and the unwavering support of the family who had stood beside him. The journey of discovery, validation, and closure marked not an end, but a transition, a newfound appreciation for the mysteries of existence, the guidance of intuition, and the remarkable endurance of the human spirit. In the weeks following the surgery and the extraordinary revelation, Thomas Whitaker settled into a reflective rhythm. Physically, he was healing. Emotionally, he was navigating a profound landscape of understanding and gratitude. The mass that had occupied his back for 62 years was gone, yet its impact remained deeply ingrained in his life. It had influenced his intuition, shaped his decisions, and silently guided him through a lifetime of challenges. Now, with clarity and perspective, he began to consider what this experience meant not only for himself, but for the lessons it could impart to others. Tom's thoughts frequently returned to his mother, Evelyn. Her instincts, once dismissed, had proven prescient. Without her vigilance, without the persistent maternal intuition that had guided him even before he could understand it, he might never have pursued the specialist consultations that led to the discovery. He reflected on the subtle ways she had observed, recorded, and respected his experiences. Her attention to detail, her sensitivity to his dreams and behaviors, and her unwavering support despite the dismissals of medical professionals. Evelyn had been the anchor throughout his life, quietly ensuring that nothing, however minor it appeared, was ignored. Carol also remained central in Tom's reflections. She had been the steady presence urging him toward action, reminding him to trust his instincts and take responsibility for his own health. Her encouragement to consult specialists, her support during medical appointments, and her compassionate understanding of his unusual experiences had been essential. Together, they discussed the importance of listening to the body's signals, acknowledging intuition, and navigating the often frustrating realities of the healthcare system. Tom realized that these lessons were not abstract. They were deeply personal, drawn from decades of experience, trial, and ultimately revelation. One afternoon, as he sat at his desk reviewing his journals from childhood to adulthood, Tom considered the subtle signs he had long ignored or dismissed. The lump on his back, the whispered conversations with Jamie, the vivid dreams, and the persistent unease in moments of decision had all been warnings, waiting to be acknowledged. He recognized the importance of early detection and vigilance, not only in rare medical phenomena, but in everyday health. He noted the gaps in his own medical care over the years, the delays caused by insurance approvals, the casual reassurances from professionals, and the obstacles imposed by cost. These reflections became a personal manifesto. Pay attention, trust instincts, and act decisively when something feels wrong. With newfound perspective, Tom began to speak more openly about his experience. He shared his story with close friends and family, emphasizing the lessons learned rather than the sensational aspects. He stressed the importance of regular checkups, prompt investigation of unusual physical signs, and advocacy for one's own health. The narrative of his life became a tool not only for personal closure, but also for raising awareness in his community. He hoped that by sharing his story, others might be inspired to listen to their own instincts, pursue necessary medical care, and recognize the subtle signals that can precede serious health issues. Thomas also reflected on the remarkable confluence of science and intuition that had defined his journey. The discovery of Jamie, the parasitic twin, was extraordinary in medical terms, but it had been his intuition, combined with his mother's vigilance and Carol's support, that ultimately guided him to the truth. The experience underscored a vital lesson. Human perception, maternal instinct, and careful observation can be as crucial as modern medicine in understanding the mysteries of life. It was a reminder that the extraordinary can often hide within the ordinary, waiting to be revealed to those who pay attention. As he moved forward, Thomas embraced a renewed sense of responsibility for his own health and well-being. He scheduled regular checkups, ensured open communication with healthcare providers, and encouraged Carol and Evelyn to prioritize their own wellness. The whispers of Jamie, once a guide, were now a memory intertwined with gratitude, shaping his appreciation for life, for the care of loved ones, and for the subtle signals that had once gone unnoticed. He had learned that vigilance, awareness, and action could change outcomes, and that the extraordinary often resides quietly within the ordinary. In quiet moments, Thomas reflected on the broader significance of his journey. The discovery of Jamie was not just a personal revelation, it was a lesson about attention, care, and the importance of listening to the body and mind. He realized that health is not simply the absence of illness, but the recognition of subtle signs, the courage to seek answers, and the willingness to act when intuition demands it. The experience had reshaped his understanding of life, health, and family, and he felt compelled to carry these lessons forward, not as a burden, but as a gift. In the weeks following Thomas Whitaker's recovery and the extraordinary discovery of Jamie, he began to understand that his story had significance beyond his own life. The experience had taught him lessons about intuition, persistence, and health awareness, and he felt a growing responsibility to share those lessons with his community. With Carol and Evelyn by his side, he began speaking quietly with friends, neighbors, and colleagues, emphasizing the importance of early detection, attentive self-care, and following one's instincts when something feels wrong, even if others insist it is trivial. Thomas reflected often on the systemic challenges he had faced over the years, the delays in specialist consultations, the repeated reassurances that the lump on his back was harmless, and the limitations of insurance coverage had all prolonged his uncertainty. Many others, he realized, could face similar obstacles, particularly older adults, who often defer care or are dismissed due to assumptions about aging. Sharing his story became not only a personal catharsis, but also a subtle advocacy for greater awareness and responsiveness within the healthcare system. He spoke to friends about the significance of paying attention to small changes in the body. A lump, a persistent pain, or an unusual sensation may seem minor, he would say, but it could be a warning sign. Don't wait. Get it checked. Advocate for yourself. Trust your instincts. His words, drawn from personal experience, resonated with many, particularly those in his circle who had also postponed care or experienced frustration navigating the medical bureaucracy. The story of Jamie, the parasitic twin who had silently influenced his life, provided a compelling example of the extraordinary being hidden within what might otherwise appear ordinary. Community interest in his story grew slowly but steadily. People were drawn not just to the unusual medical phenomenon, but also to the human narrative woven throughout it. A mother's intuition, the guidance of a silent companion, the persistence required to pursue answers, and the emotional journey toward understanding and closure. Thomas found that when he shared his story, listeners often reflected on their own experiences, realizing that they had overlooked subtle signs in themselves or their loved ones. Conversation shifted from mere curiosity to introspection, and in many cases, action. Evelyn became an integral part of this community dialogue. She shared her perspective as a mother whose instincts had been ignored, but ultimately validated, emphasizing the importance of listening to intuition alongside professional guidance. Trust what you feel, she told neighbors and friends who gathered in informal discussions. It's not always about what tests can show, but about paying attention to subtle cues that something might be wrong. And don't ever hesitate to seek a second opinion. Her words, reinforced by Thomas's experience, created a powerful narrative about the intersection of intuition and medical care. Carol also contributed by highlighting the importance of support and advocacy. She encouraged caregivers and spouses to pay attention to loved ones' health changes and to assist them in navigating the healthcare system. Her emphasis on partnership and proactive care helped frame Thomas's experience as not just a medical anomaly, but as a model for responsible engagement with personal health. Together, they presented a holistic view: intuition, support, vigilance, and action. The Whitakers began considering broader outreach, exploring ways to document their story for the benefit of others beyond their immediate circle. They envisioned workshops, community talks, and eventually written materials that could inform people about the rare medical phenomenon and, more importantly, the practical lessons it embodied. Recognize early signs, trust intuition, advocate for proper care, and embrace the support of loved ones. The focus was never sensationalism, but education, inspiration, and empowerment. As Thomas walked through his neighborhood or met with friends at local gatherings, he carried a quiet sense of purpose. Jamie, the twin who had silently shaped his life for decades, had now become a catalyst for awareness and understanding. What had once been an intimate, secret part of his experience had evolved into a shared story with meaningful impact. The journey from uncertainty to revelation had transformed his perspective, and he felt compelled to use that perspective to benefit others. In quiet moments at home, Thomas reflected on the broader implications of his life's extraordinary journey. The experience had intertwined the extraordinary with the ordinary, blending intuition, maternal insight, medical intervention, and personal persistence into a narrative that could educate and inspire. He understood that while Jamie's presence within him had been unique, the lessons were universal. Listen to your body, heed subtle warnings, advocate for your health, and trust the guidance of those who care for you. Through community engagement, Thomas recognized that the extraordinary could inform the ordinary, creating a legacy that transcended the personal and touched the lives of many. In the weeks that followed the completion of his recovery and the careful reflection with his family, Thomas Whitaker found a quiet clarity settling over his life. The lump that had been a constant, unseen companion for more than 60 years was gone, yet the lessons it carried remained indelibly etched into his consciousness. He realized that the extraordinary revelation of Jamie, his parasitic twin, was not merely a medical anomaly. It was a lens through which he could understand the depth of human resilience, the power of intuition, and the importance of attentive care for one's health. Thomas often thought back to the earliest moments of his awareness, childhood dreams of darkness and a silent presence, whispered words that guided his decisions, and the persistent feeling that he had never truly been alone. He revisited each memory with fresh understanding, connecting the fragmented whispers of the past to the concrete reality that had now been revealed. Jamie, though never living independently, had been an inseparable part of his life, an invisible guide shaping his instincts, influencing decisions, and even protecting him from harm in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. Evelyn's role in this journey became clearer to Thomas than ever. Her maternal intuition, which had once been dismissed by doctors and others, had proven prescient and protective. From the very beginning, she had recognized subtle signs that others overlooked. The twin-like dreams, the small but persistent lump, and the patterns of his behavior that defied explanation. Her vigilance, coupled with her love and attentiveness, had guided Thomas toward the medical care that ultimately led to the discovery. He reflected on the importance of listening to and trusting maternal instincts, a lesson not only for himself, but for anyone navigating life with unseen or subtle signs of health or well-being. Carol's unwavering support also weighed heavily on his thoughts. Her encouragement, patience, and practical care had created the conditions for Thomas to confront the unknown with courage. She had been the steady presence advocating for him in a system that was often slow, bureaucratic, and dismissive. Thomas realized that without such support, he may have deferred medical consultation indefinitely, and the answers he had long sought might never have been discovered. The partnership they shared became a model for resilience, teamwork, and trust, illustrating how personal relationships can be critical in navigating life's challenges. As Thomas considered the broader implications of his journey, he reflected on the lessons it offered to others. He realized that awareness of one's body, prompt medical attention, and advocacy for personal health were paramount. The story of Jamie was a powerful metaphor for listening to subtle signals, recognizing the extraordinary in what may seem ordinary, and acting decisively when intuition demands it. Through his experience, Thomas recognized that many people delay seeking care, ignore persistent minor symptoms, or dismiss the quiet whispers of their own instincts, sometimes with profound consequences. He also recognized that life often unfolds in ways beyond conventional understanding. The convergence of medical science, maternal intuition, and lifelong internal guidance had created an outcome that was extraordinary, yet grounded in real human experience. Thomas resolved to honor the lessons of his journey by living mindfully, sharing his story responsibly, and emphasizing the importance of awareness, vigilance, and proactive care. He wanted others to understand that intuition, observation, and persistence can sometimes be as vital as technology and expertise in uncovering truths that matter. Even in quiet moments, Thomas reflected on the spiritual dimension of his experience. Jamie's presence had been a silent, guiding force, teaching patience, resilience, and attentiveness. The twin had existed within him as both a literal and symbolic reminder that life is often more complex than it appears, and that unseen influences can shape our paths in profound ways. Recognizing and integrating this knowledge allowed Thomas to approach the future with greater confidence, humility, and appreciation for the mysteries that accompany human existence. Ultimately, Thomas understood that the story was not just about a rare medical phenomenon, it was about human perception, intuition, and the interwoven relationships that sustain us. The experience had provided a framework for understanding life, health, and the subtle connections between mind, body, and family. He carried forward a renewed commitment to listening, observing, and acting, confident that awareness and attentiveness could transform uncertainty into clarity, fear into understanding, and mystery into profound insight. In the end, Thomas Whitaker's journey was both extraordinary and deeply human. It was a story of silent guidance, maternal intuition, steadfast support, and the power of persistence. It was a testament to the importance of paying attention, valuing relationships, and trusting the subtle cues of life. And above all, it was a story about recognizing the extraordinary within the ordinary and carrying forward the lessons of a silent companion whose presence had shaped a lifetime. As Thomas Whitaker settled fully into life after surgery and recovery, he began to view his journey with a quiet sense of awe and gratitude. The mass that had existed in his back for more than 6 decades, once a source of subtle mystery, whispering guidance, and silent intuition, had been removed. Yet its influence remained profoundly present in his understanding of himself, his relationships, and the lessons that life had quietly offered him. He recognized that the extraordinary event of carrying a parasitic twin, Jamie, was not merely a medical anomaly, but a lens through which he could reflect on resilience, intuition, and the deep connections that shape human existence. Thomas often thought back to the small, unassuming moments that had defined his life in ways he had not understood until now. The whispers in the quiet of his childhood, the recurrent dreams, the subtle guidance that he had always trusted instinctively, all of it had pointed toward a reality far more extraordinary than he could have imagined. Jamie had been with him throughout his life, a silent companion whose presence had been integral to his decisions, safety, and emotional development. Now, with the truth fully revealed, Thomas felt a profound sense of closure, understanding, and connection to the unseen forces that had shaped his path. He reflected on the pivotal role of his mother, Evelyn. Her intuition had guided him long before he could recognize it. The dreams she experienced during her pregnancy, the subtle observations she made throughout his childhood, and her unwavering attention had been crucial. Evelyn's prescience had ultimately led to the discovery of Jamie, validating decades of concern and insight. Thomas understood that trusting maternal instincts, often dismissed in the modern medical context, could reveal truths far beyond ordinary perception. Her guidance had been a cornerstone, ensuring that the silent warnings and unusual signs he experienced were never entirely ignored. Carol's steadfast presence remained equally significant in his reflections. Her support, encouragement, and advocacy had provided the practical and emotional framework for Thomas to confront what might have remained undiscovered. She had insisted on consultations, navigated the healthcare system with him, and offered unwavering reassurance. Through her, Thomas had learned that personal support systems, attentive care, and advocacy are just as critical as medical expertise in pursuing health and understanding the extraordinary nuances of life. Their partnership illustrated the power of trust, patience, and shared responsibility. Thomas also contemplated the broader lessons his experience could impart. The story of Jamie, the parasitic twin, was extraordinary in itself, but the human dimensions, the attentiveness to small signs, the courage to seek answers, and the integration of intuition with medical care were universal. He realized that many people ignore subtle physical or emotional signals, dismiss intuition, or face barriers in the healthcare system, and that these delays can have serious consequences. By sharing his story, he hoped to inspire others to listen carefully to their bodies, to advocate for themselves, and to act when instinct and observation signal that something is amiss. In addition, Thomas recognized the importance of reflecting on life's extraordinary mysteries and how seemingly impossible experiences can shape personal growth. Jamie's presence had offered guidance, protection, and a subtle influence that had cultivated patience, resilience, and attentiveness. The lessons were not merely scientific, they were profoundly human. He understood that awareness, introspection, and responsiveness to both intuition and evidence are essential tools for navigating life. The extraordinary, he realized, often exists quietly alongside the ordinary, waiting to be acknowledged. As he shared his story within the community, Thomas focused not on sensationalism, but on education, empowerment, and reflection. He emphasized the importance of early detection, regular checkups, and the willingness to challenge assumptions. He spoke openly about intuition, maternal guidance, and the subtle cues that often accompany extraordinary circumstances. Through conversations, workshops, and informal discussions, he hoped to encourage others to recognize the signs, trust their instincts, and embrace vigilance in health and life decisions. Finally, Thomas reflected on gratitude. Gratitude for Jamie, whose silent presence had shaped his life, for Evelyn, whose intuition had guided him, for Carol, whose unwavering support had provided strength, and for the medical professionals who approached the discovery with careful precision and respect. The journey had transformed uncertainty into clarity, fear into understanding, and mystery into wisdom. It had revealed the profound impact of awareness, intuition, and attentive care, both in extraordinary and everyday circumstances. In the quiet moments, Thomas would sit beneath the pecan tree where Jamie's remains had been laid to rest. He would close his eyes, recalling the whispers, the dreams, and the presence that had guided him, and he would smile, knowing that the lessons of resilience, vigilance, and gratitude would remain with him forever. His story was now complete, not just a tale of rare medical phenomena, but a testament to the extraordinary lessons that life quietly teaches, if only we are willing to listen. As Thomas Whitaker's story shows us, life can hide mysteries in the most unexpected places, sometimes even within ourselves. What may seem ordinary, small, or insignificant could carry lessons, warnings, or truths that shape our journey in ways we cannot see. The message is clear. Listen to your body, trust your instincts, and never ignore the subtle signs that something may be amiss. Seek answers, advocate for yourself, and cherish the guidance of those who care for you. Life is fragile, extraordinary, and full of hidden stories waiting to be discovered. If this story inspired you to reflect on your own health, your intuition, or the moments you might have overlooked, leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Remember, awareness and action today can make all the difference tomorrow.